to try to randomly, because that's kind of the way I work, give you little historical context that might help you to understand some of the patterns that have occurred in the relationship between America and China since the two countries began dealing with each other, which actually goes back as far as 1783, when the first American ship left New York Harbor to trade with the Chinese. Unfortunately for you, I'm not going to go back to 1783, because I would be talking for a lot longer than 40 minutes, but I am going to go back to May of 1865. And in May of 1865 in Hong Kong, a tea ship from New York City shows up. And a woman is on the ship. She just spent 149 days on the ship going from New York to Hong Kong. And she's dressed in her wedding dress. She's an American woman by the name of Adele Field. And she's there on board the ship waiting for her fiancé to come pick her up, because they'd met in America and fallen in love. And he had been sent out to Asia to be a Baptist minister to Chinese workers in Siam and Bangkok. And they had planned to get married in Hong Kong, and then they would go together to Bangkok to preach to the Chinese in Bangkok. And so she's on board ship in her wedding finest, and a rowboat shows up, but her husband or fiancé-to-be is not on board the rowboat. The guy gets off the rowboat and says, sorry to tell you, but while you were on board ship, your fiancé caught typhoid fever and is now dead. And so Adele Field found herself, as she wrote later, very alone and very much in desolation on the shores of Asia. The ship captain says to Adele, come back to New York with me, I'll give you free passage, everything will be fine, you'll have a life after this. But Adele says no, she's going to go to Bangkok, preach to the Chinese, and carry on the life's work of her husband. And Adele Field becomes the first of what would ultimately be thousands of single American women missionaries preaching to Asians, but particularly to the Chinese in Asia. She sort of occupies this really interesting part of a generation of Americans. She was born in 1839. She's one of the first generation of American women who actually got a college education. She became, even though she was quite young, a radical, very powerful abolitionist. She was a Yankee, born in New York State. And by the time she meets Cyrus Chilcott, her fiancé, she's the principal of a girls' school in New York State. And she started this trend of hundreds and hundreds of American women going to China as single American women to minister to the Chinese. And in Bangkok, she had this idea that ministering to the Chinese was kind of like agriculture. You would plant some seeds and they would grow over time, and you would slowly over time appeal to the hearts and minds of the Chinese. Whereas her boss, the Baptist minister, looked at ministering to the Chinese as a war. And his idea was basically standing on street corners and yelling at the Chinese and telling them what they should do, like stop worshiping your ancestors, cut off your cues, embrace Christianity because you're all heathens. And these two very different ideas about how to deal with the Chinese clashed in Bangkok. There was a very small mission, and he started to launch a private investigation of her for blasphemy. And he dug up the fact that she'd played cards with some Westerners. She'd even danced with unmarried men. She was seen smoking cigarettes. Actually, in some cases, it was hashish, but he didn't know that. She later wrote a really fascinating first-person story about that. And meanwhile, she began writing letters back to churches in America describing her experiences of being in a Chinese family, of getting to know Chinese wives and women and mothers, and became quite popular in the United States, so much so that her letters were read in churches across America. Sort of letters from Bangkok, letters from Siam, and she became this sort of fundraising dynamo for the Baptists. And so her mission chief, this American Baptist, charges her with blasphemy. And the American Baptist Missionary Society in Boston demands that she return to Boston to face blasphemy charges. Now, on her way back to Boston, she stops at Hong Kong, and she meets another Baptist missionary there who has a mission in Shantou, Swatow, which is on the sort of the southern underbelly of Guangdong province, who said, while you're waiting for your ship, come up come up to Swatow and let's talk about your missionary ideas. And so she went up to Swatow and she talked more about her ideas, saying that what we really need to do is stop yelling at the Chinese and begin to give them sort of Western technology, Western science, Western education, and use that as a way into the hearts and minds of the Chinese. And he really liked this idea. So he said, look, go back to Boston, fight the charges, and I'll do my best to get you a position working with me. So she goes back to Boston, and partially because there's also this letter writing campaign from women across the United States basically saying Adele Field's my hero, you cannot bust her for blasphemy, you have to free her. She beats the charges. And also in addition to the fact that she was raising so much money for the Baptist mission, they basically decide that she's not guilty of the charges, and she goes back to China to work with this in Shantou. Within a year, she starts the Path of Brightness, which is literally the first modern literacy campaign in China's history for women. She quickly expands the curriculum to include hygiene, childbirthing techniques using hot water, for example, geography, basic medical skills. And so much so that her missionary activity quickly actually starts to look more like an early version of the Peace Corps than this evangelical war against the Chinese spirit that her boss was conducting in Bangkok. In the 1870s and 1880s, as she comes back to the States on furlough, she gets a medical degree. She becomes one of the first graduates of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. And in so doing, she really becomes this heroine for American women, and hundreds of them follow in her footsteps. And what fascinates me about her is that, on one hand, she and her sisters had a significant influence on Chinese society. So they really were the first lobby in Chinese society, foreigners pushing for basically what one could argue is the most significant human rights advance in modern Chinese history, which is the unbinding of women's feet. They really pushed the Qing Empire and did a lot of lobbying saying this is a totally barbaric practice, you can't do it, so much so that by 1902 the Qing authorities basically issued a circular that's saying we have to begin to phase out at least the binding of women's feet. In addition, they also fought female infanticide. They would put baskets by rivers and lakes in China in which they say, do not throw your babies into the stream, put them in the basket instead. And so this push against trying to lobby the Chinese not to kill your female babies, but to at least allow them to exist in orphanages across China. They opened those orphanages as well. Interestingly enough, though, because so many of these women were single American women, who were coming to China to teach Chinese women to be nice Christian women who would then find a nice Christian Chinese man and have a nice Christian Chinese family, many Chinese women looked at them and said, I don't want to do what you preach, I want to actually do what you do. And so the first class that graduated from Jinling Women's University in Nanjing took a vow not to marry, which obviously pissed off a lot of Chinese men. But you could see this kind of back and forth. Now, so that's sort of the American women influencing the Chinese. But for the Chinese and for China, it became this area where single American women could come to be all that they could not be in the United States. Because you had women at the time getting, for the first time, actually a decent education in America. But once they graduated from college, the job opportunities in the United States were limited. You could be a nurse, you could be a school teacher. But in China, they were surgeons when they were barely allowed in the operating room in the United States. In China, they were heading departments and universities when they were barely teaching at the college level in America. And this idea of China as this field in which American women could really be successful has continued pretty much to this day. So the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, Pearl Buck, won it for writing about China. Some of the greatest female reporters in China worked in China. For example, in the 1920s and the 1930s, there'd be Emily Hahn. And then flash forward to the 1980s, and you have the premier consultant firm in China doing deals between Westerners and Chinese was run by a woman, and basically who only hired other women, the Kamsky and Associates. And then finally in 1995, where from my perspective, It's no coincidence at all that Hillary Clinton kind of rediscovers her political mojo in Beijing at the UN International Women's Conference, where her statement that women's rights are human rights really galvanized the whole generation. And so China has always been this subtle but very, very clear, has a role as a place where American women have gone to be very successful. And these are the type of things that I try to unearth in writing the book. Now, one of the patterns or one of the themes of the book is how the relationship between China and America has moved over time in this sort of love-hate tangle. It's kind of like this caught in this Buddhist cycle of reincarnation where every 20 years or so we fall in love with each other, and then every 20 years or so we basically fall in hate with each other. You have Americans having this overwhelmed enthusiasm about China. An example would be 1989, where people across the United States thought China was going to turn suddenly into an Asian democracy, which was then crashed with the crackdown in 1989 on the pro-democracy protesters around Tiananmen Square. You had the Chinese in the 19th century looking at America as the place that they could go to really become very successful, and America as the beacon of modernity, which was then smashed, for example, in 1918 at the Treaty of Versailles, when the United States basically told the Chinese that they would back China's claims in World War I, only then to throw them into the wolves and to allow Japan to keep, in this case, the occupation of Shandong province. And this sort of warp and weave of the history between the two places is really something that drives the whole idea for the book. Other things that I think, from my perspective, are fascinating is that an example would be when we began our relationship with China in 1783, the families that began the China trade were the families that made the first fortunes in the United States. So the New England and the Mid-Atlantic capitalists really made their money in the China trade. So you have the Astors, the Lows, the Greens, the Delanos, as in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They made their first fortunes trading with China. And the idea to trade with China was extremely important for the continuation of the existence of the United States, because in 1783 we'd beaten the British. We found ourselves completely blocked out of all the British ports in the Caribbean. We couldn't trade, and so the financiers of the American Revolution came up with this idea, this sort of Hail Mary pass of let's go to China to trade. And in going to China, the trade boomed, and it allowed for capitalists to make money, who then took their profits and reinvested their profits in the United States, that created basically the foundations for the American Industrial Revolution. And so you have this event in the early 1800s of Chinese money funding the creation of an American economic dynamo. And you flash forward to the 1980s and you turn it around and you realize that it's American money founding the foundation of China as an economic dynamo. You have these really fascinating, from my perspective, these fascinating historical parallels. Other historical parallels, when we had our Civil War in the United States, the Chinese were also having their version of a civil war. They have, in our history with the Taiping Rebellion. So our histories together have this sort of cosmic symbiosis, which I found to be interesting. In addition, both sides have a very schizophrenic view of each other. So 1868, William Seward, who was the Secretary of State for Abraham Lincoln, who himself was a man fascinated with Asia, concludes a treaty with the Qing court which opens the way for significant Chinese immigration to the United States. He basically encourages, and his idea was that the more Chinese who came to America, the stronger America would become. That's in 1868. And it represented a really important strain of thinking in America to bring industrious people, hardworking people to our country to build it. So that's one idea of China as an opportunity. 2 years later, Congress is debating the Naturalization Act of 1870, which was the act that was passed to give free slaves citizenship in the United States. But during those debates, it was a really hot topic of should America allow Asians to become naturalized citizens as well? And the decision was no, right? Only blacks and whites can be citizens. And that again, this idea of China not as an opportunity, but Chinese as a threat. And it sparked an open season on the Chinese across the West. So in California, out of 200 towns or so, Chinese were ethnically cleansed. They were strung up on lampposts in Los Angeles. You probably know the history. They were massacred in Wyoming. They were massacred in the Northwest Territory. In Denver, all of Chinatown was burned while the cops looked on, leading to 1882, where the Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which was the first time in American history that the United States Congress took action to block a specific ethnic group from coming to America. It was extremely critically important in terms of the Americans' identity of themselves. No, we don't want Chinese to come to our country. So you have this idea in America both as China as a potential opportunity, a place where the founding fortunes of Americans were made, a place where Americans, specifically on the capitalist side, believed that Chinese could come and work, with this other idea of Chinese as a threat to the United States, right? Significant amount of literature in the scientific periodicals of the day saying, well, the Chinatowns the bacteria in Chinatowns are much deadlier than the bacteria everywhere else. This idea of the Chinese as being dirty somehow, sort of bizarre thinking from our perspective now, but then it was completely considered absolute expert opinion. But in the same way, you also have the Chinese looking at America in extremely mixed views. And so about the same time that this was happening in the United States, our own schizophrenia, the Chinese were working out their own issues vis-a-vis us. So around 1850 or so, a man by the name of Young Wing comes to the United States. He's a boy from Guangdong province. And he's brought to America by a missionary, and he's from southern Guangdong, where it's never really cold, and he's sent to New England for 4 winters, where he has to chop his own wood and walk 3 miles a day to school. He becomes sort of a Yankee schoolboy. He then graduates and gets a scholarship to Yale. And this is a period of time when the Chinese have just lost the Opium War to the Brits. And the Chinese are really interested in how are we going to become strong. And Young Wing comes up with this idea that the only way we can get strong is if we embrace American-style education. And so he hatches this plan to bring hundreds of Chinese boys to the United States. He was a bit of a sexist, no girls allowed. Bringing hundreds of Chinese boys and putting them into the homes of people in Hartford, Connecticut, where they learned English the hard way. Basically, at dinner table, if they didn't know how to say pass the potatoes in English, they wouldn't get a second course. So they learned English very well, and they excelled in their schools, and they went to high school in Hartford with the idea of them graduating and going to college in the United States, specifically to study technology, military science, etc. But the boys began to change. So they were initially all dressed in Confucian robes, and they began to ditch those and wear jackets. And their Confucian minders were a little bit worried about that. Then they began to lobby to cut off the queues that they had on the back of the head, which showed their fealty to the emperor because they wanted to play baseball. Their minders were a little bit more worried about that. And then when a few of them started sneaking off to the Congregationalist church, their minders really got worried about that, so much so that they lobbied the Qing Empire to shut the program down, and by 1880 or so, it was shut down. And so again, you have this idea in China of both America as this place of opportunity, a place where you can learn modernization, and this threat to Chineseness. And the Confucian minders wrote these notes back to Beijing saying these boys are becoming what they called foreign ghosts. So again, China itself also has these similar tensions. One of the ideas that I tried to play with in the book is to try to combine the story of Chinese in America with the story of China and America. Because in the academic world, they're often kind of divided, with Asian American studies here and US-China relations over there. And the story of Chinese in America is really important in China. Is one of the reasons why the Chinese really sort of respected the United States, because so many Chinese came to America and did so well. And in addition, the story of Chinese America is actually a really fascinating story about an incredibly successful group of people. And so in the West, we know, in America, we generally know, yes, okay, so the Chinese built half the transcontinental railroad, and the Chinese suffered greatly under anti-Chinese racism. But a lot of people don't really know the fact that the Chinese organizations the Chinatown organizations were incredibly successful at raising money from the working men and the very few women, Chinese in the United States, that they then used to pay for some of the best lawyers in the United States, who then took many of these anti-Chinese ordinances and laws, and they basically took the federal government and local governments to court. So much so that Supreme Court decisions on several of the cases formed the foundation for the attack against separate but equal schooling for African American children in the 1950s. And that the seminal case that decided for all time, one hopes, that if you're born in America, you are an American, is a case that involved a Chinese boy who was born in the United States. And that story about the Chinese not being, which blows apart this concept in some, you hear it in some parts of the United States, of the Chinese of being passive in a way to their treatment in the United States. It sort of blows that out of the water, which is something that I found to be surprising and interesting in the story of on us and them. So that's just a little bit of some of the stories and the flavor of what I attempted to do in the book. But I'd like to open it up to questions. We have lots of time. If you'd like to talk about current events, which generally people seem to want to talk about, I'm happy to get into that. North Korea, South China Sea, Donald Trump even. I found to be, Trump actually, I just talk a little bit about Trump. One of the things I found interesting in Trump is that he is not an outlier when it comes to looking at China at all. And that on the campaign, I mean, like all the presidents before him, actually, Trump on the campaign trail vis-a-vis China is very different than Trump in office vis-a-vis China. And basically, all of his predecessors since Richard Nixon were like that as well, except for one, Obama. Obama was a little different. Not necessarily better, but a little different. But all of the presidential candidates, except for Obama, ran on a platform of criticizing the China policy of their predecessors. Trump also has a lot of flavor of 19th century San Francisco, not the city of love or the summer of love, but 19th century San Francisco in his rants on the campaign trail against the Chinese. And interestingly enough, the Build the Wall chant actually started in the United States in the 1880s in San Francisco, courtesy of a fellow by the name of Dennis Kearney, who was the head of the California Workingmen's Party, which was an anti-Chinese organization. It ran against both the robber barons, the capitalists of the days, but also it ran against allowing Chinese labor into America. And Dennis Kearney at the time led chants in San Francisco political rallies of build the wall in order to stop Chinese immigration into America, not Trump's Mexican illegal immigration into the United States. But that's just sort of a flavor again. My perspective on Trump is that he actually falls neatly into a category, a certain type of American. In addition, he also, in his respect of the authoritarian nature of Chinese society, he also falls into a category of Americans who have, since the 19th century, believed that the Chinese needed to be ruled by an emperor and not by a democracy. So I think in that sense, he also kind of fits neatly into that category. But with that, I'll stop ranting, and I'd like to get into your questions so we can talk for the rest of the hour or so. Yeah, so it's funny because now, I mean, Trump ran on Trump ran with this threat that he was going to slap a 45% tariff on Chinese goods coming to the United States, which everyone knew was going to be a joke. But we also have to remember that the model that China has followed up until about today is not actually a unique model, and that the United States in the 19th century really embraced a high tariff model where the government was directly involved in subsidizing American industries and protecting American industries against foreign competition. And so this concept that now that China is somehow a total outlier in the international financial system is not I mean, there's a certain sense, yes, they're quote unquote breaking the rules that we wrote, starting in the 1940s, after the Second World War, but they've also sort of embraced the very American model of development that we pursued in the 19th century, where we blocked foreign imports in order to nurture our industries, which is what the Chinese are doing. We put a lot of government money into subsidizing American companies so they could grow up and become competitors to foreign countries. And then we criticized foreign countries for putting up tariffs against our goods. And so, history again, I think in many cases between America and China moves in cycles. And what the Chinese are doing now is objectionable to American interests, but they actually have taken a page from our playbook in many ways. So the Second World War is for an American writer, and writing on China is a difficult topic, because in the United States we have this whole issue of, quote unquote, who lost China. And for many years in the 60s and 70s, 80s, and 90s, partially because of the McCarthy period and also partially because of the Vietnam War, the story about China was written in such a way that there was Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, who was a total baddie, kind of a cartoonish bad guy. There was Mao, who was a communist, but he was actually a heroic, real fighter of the Japanese. And our policy was one of supporting the wrong guy. And that was sort of generally the narrative, that we actually should have been supporting Mao because Mao was a real hero. And I wanted to draw that into question because subsequent historical research has actually come to the conclusion that Chiang Kai-shek, for all of his problems, actually fought a lot against the Japanese. And if you look at casualty figures, 90% of the casualties in the Second World War in China were KMT, were nationalist troops. And that the communists actually kept their powder very much dry, waiting for what Mao knew would be the inevitable civil war that began in 1945 when Japan was defeated. And so my argument was not that America lost China, but it was trying to unpack this incredibly complicated story and to be more fair to Chiang Kai-shek than history has in the past been to him. So it's a messy topic, though, and ideologically it's complicated. So I lived in China for 20 years. So I first was there 80, 82, then 88, 89, and then 96, 2003, and then 2011 to 2016. So sort of 4 major periods of time. 80 to 82, I was a monkey, but I could talk in Chinese. And so I was surrounded anywhere I went. By sometimes, once I opened my mouth and started speaking Chinese, the crowd got really big. And no matter where I went, I was surrounded because the monkey could talk. But I lived in a room with 7 Chinese guys, a 10 by 15 foot room with 7 Chinese guys for a year and a half. And there was an enormous amount of curiosity on their part about, my life, down to like the minutia of my life. Like, did you sleep naked? Why don't you take a shower at night? Why do you take a shower in the morning? You should wash your feet before you go to bed. If you don't, you're going to die young. And these type of issues, this sort of intense curiosity. 88, 89 was, but then I was a student, and the Chinese government didn't care about foreign students at all. I mean, there was some monitoring, but the fact in Nanjing that I could live with 7 guys and witness their fights, their love affairs, and everything, was a sign that, at least in Nanjing, we were not that important and viewed as a threat. When I returned to China in 88, as a reporter, my status had changed. And so because of that, naturally, the Chinese party stayed, and the people will relate to you different. But in 88, it was really a very different country than it is today. And in a lot of ways, it was freer because people were debating all sorts of things. There was the first nude exhibition. There was the first modern art exhibition. There were salons all over universities in Beijing discussing and debating democracy. There was these big topics like, should the party and the government be separate, which is a topic that can't even be talked about today. Then it was on the front page of newspapers in China. And then as the buildup to Tiananmen Square happened and thousands of people were on the streets, everyone talked to you. People, military officers, relatively high people in the Communist Party, people of a certain ilk. The people who didn't like foreigners obviously wouldn't talk to you, but the openness in the society was palpable. And then the crackdown happens and I get tossed out. And I return in 1991 on short trips, but mostly in the South, which has always been a little different. It's more freewheeling, as the Chinese say, 天高皇帝远, like the emperor is far and the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. In the South, they've always done things differently. But back in China in 96, I found a different country. And once you write things about social change in China, people would want to talk to you. But if you got into politics, people really didn't want to talk to you that much at all. But people, talk in the beginning of the internet, and there's just a lot of people. And then in the business communities, people will talk. And as a journalist with the Washington Post, because 96 was tighter than it was in 88, there's just your status changes as well. But it was sort of the bronze era for journalists in China. There's never been a golden era in a way, but it was okay up until 2003 when I left again. There was, Jiang Zemin, for all his foibles, had grown up in a China that was not communist, and he had lived in Romania, which was a little looser, and he didn't sweat a lot of the small stuff, except Falun Gong, which he smashed. But there was a lot. The press was freer. Chinese reporters would interact with us much more freely. Today, it's a much different place. They've had a couple of decades now of patriotic education campaign, which is sort of propaganda, patriotism campaign. And the tenor of the Chinese youth is strongly nationalistic. In some cases justified because their country is hugely important and the growth rate is enormous and they've yanked hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So there's a pride in China which is justified, but there's also this jingoistic vibe. The party state is much more oppressive than it used to be in terms of not allowing open debate. And so that's changed the nature of how people interact. But that said, from 2011 to 2016, I wasn't a reporter anymore. So I maintained my contacts with my friends, and because I wasn't writing about them, they would see me and there would be no issue. But the academics who I would now see freely as a sort of a quote-unquote scholar, if I had been a reporter, it would be much more difficult for me to go see them. Being a reporter in China is just a lot more difficult than it was, and I'm really glad I'm not, and I wasn't for that period of time. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. So there's a Chinese publisher who is now in the process of translating my book, but the issue is how much is going to be censored. And he's told me now several chapters just have to be deleted, and that's not going to fly. And basically, they also said that every mention of the word Tiananmen has to be taken out of the book, even when it's just a place name. So it's kind of wacky, but it's like search for Tiananmen, delete. And so I've basically said, why don't we just leave a blank space? We can't do that because that's a question of face. So it's going to be an interesting process of negotiation should we ever get there. Well, I think that there's a couple of things. Most immediately, it's the North Korea imbroglio. And a lot of Americans have this question about why can't or why won't the Chinese do more? And I think the answer to that question pertains to the fact that China looks at North Korea as an issue of existential importance to the rule of the Communist Party in China. And the reason it looks at it like that is because we have this idea of, why can't the Chinese just shut off the oil, squeeze it, let it collapse, and we've solved the problem. And the Chinese think, if we have regime change in North Korea, what's that going to do to people in China who want to change our government, right? From their perspective, North Korea is their East Germany. And the thing that is most studied in China by the party elite is the collapse of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, right? They look at Gorbachev as a goat, not as a hero. And they look at what he did and say, there but for the grace of God go I. We do not want to follow in that. And so any push from their perspective about squeezing North Korea and pushing it towards regime collapse, they worry that it's going to change their regime in China. There's only 5 Leninist states left in the world. Now there would be 4 if they push North Korea over the brink. And then you have these other issues. People say, oh, it's because the refugees. That's a small issue. You have a peninsula united pretty much under a pro-capitalist government. You'd have a whole bunch of issues about who's going to be controlling the nuclear stocks. But then you also have millions of Chinese Koreans who live in Manchuria, Dongbei, in northeast China. And if the Korean peninsula becomes united, what if they start feeling the tug of the motherland? Right, and want to take out, parts of China and have it hooked onto the Korean. So that becomes a secessionist issue, right? And the Chinese don't like secessionists, as we've seen with Tibet, et cetera. And so for them, this is an issue of existential importance. It's not just a problem on their border. It's an issue really that is key to their survival. They view it as key to their survival, and so that is a reason why we cannot think that they're going to go the full Monty with the North Koreans and really push them up against the wall. That's not going to be the way to solve the problem. So then we're left with a lot of other bad choices. But Obama, and it's very easy for us now to criticize Trump, right? It's so easy to criticize the Donald. I'm a New Yorker. I know he's a jerk. But it's just too easy to criticize. Because for 8 years, Obama had this problem. And he outsourced his North Korea policy pretty much to the Chinese, thinking that they were going to solve it. And not clearly, I don't think, understanding the fact that their view is that we cannot let this regime collapse. In spite of the fact that in China, the Chinese people are fed up with North Korea. I went to North Korea on a Chinese tour, and all the folks I was with, my Chinese friends, were like, God, this place is a joke. Just like my country in the 1960s, right? They call Kim Jong-un Jin Sanpang, right? Kim number 3 fatty, and he's a joke. And the Chinese look at it and like, these people can't do economic reforms, they're idiots. So socially, the Chinese have moved on. But inside the party state, there's a much more serious, different view of the issue. And they look at it as an issue of regime maintenance for them. So I think of the things that really bedevil us right now. The other issue is an economic issue between us and them. And that the Chinese are devoting significant amount of resources into robotics, artificial intelligence, advanced medical equipment, all the advanced manufacturing, advanced materials, and putting electric vehicles, renewable technology, energy technology. And they're moving ahead on all burners, on all fronts in these type of areas, using the power of state money, wetting it with private capital in some cases. And a lot of people in the United States say, well, those are all state-run activities, and state-run activities are always doomed to fail because state-run capital can't really be successful. But in China, it's actually been pretty successful. And I think that if the United States doesn't get its act together on those fronts as well, not necessarily following China, but doing similar types of research in those areas, we're going to find ourselves in a very difficult position with the Chinese because they will dominate the economy of the 21st century. And this Donald Trump stuff about embracing the economy of 1950s America is not going to cut it when we compete with China. And the Chinese are competing with us, so we better begin competing with them. And I think that long term, it might even be more significant than North Korea. One of them was that America is about to slip on a banana peel. The Chinese have been predicting that we're going to collapse since there were rolling blackouts in American cities in the 1960s. You had the front page of 中国青年报, the China Youth Daily, basically saying there's blackouts in Detroit, there's riots everywhere, America's going to fall apart next week. And this is from the 1960s. You had the 2008 financial crisis, another round where the Chinese were predicting that we're going to fall apart. And I think that is a recurring theme in Chinese media, that America is on the edge of a cliff, about to fall off. Even a clock is right twice a day, so at a certain point they actually could make it. They could be right. But that, I think, the underestimation of the American system and our ability to self-correct, I think is something that the Chinese often are guilty of. I think that in many cases they don't understand how, that the American system of government was actually set up to be inefficient by the founding fathers, who were more afraid of an autocrat than they were of chaos. And that it moves into the Chinese real concern with chaos and their obsession with stability and their belief that our system is inefficient so we can't get anything done. In some cases, we're so efficient that we can't get anything done. But in some cases, we actually sort of embrace that the Britishism about America, that we try everything, we fail everything, whatever. How does it go? We fail at everything first before we finally come to the right conclusion. Destroyed that nice phraseology. But I think that it has to fundamentally underlies that they don't understand how our system works. They just think it's inefficient. On one hand, you see China moving ahead and in very advanced research on the leading technologies of the world for the 21st century and trying to create a 21st century economy. On the other hand, there are black swans in China's future. And one of the black swans is, there's environment as a black swan, there's potential political chaos because they really haven't answered a lot of the political questions yet. But another black swan is demographic, a black swan. In that partially because, I'll get into your question about personality and issues, but part of the fallout of the one-child policy is a demographic picture in China that is relatively dark. They're aging faster than the United States. This year or next year, the median age in China is going to be older than the median age of of America. They're going to have, and in 10 years, they're going to have a much higher percentage of their population above the age of 60 than we will in America. Over 100 million people over 80. And it's a part and parcel because 300 million people were not born in China. And that's a huge amount of young people to not have. Now, yes, in terms of global warming, it's a huge contribution to stopping global warming. But in terms of a potentially healthy economy, removing those people from the workforce makes China's push to become a rich country all the more difficult. Now, in terms of how has the one-child policy affected society in China, I think it's a great question. And so in China, you have lots of debates about how the one-child family kids are more selfish, how they don't view the family as, they don't have a communal perspective of the family. Not having a brother and sister has really changed them. They're called little emperors. There's a lot of stuff on the Chinese internet about how Chinese boys aren't manly enough because they're coddled by their mothers, because they're the only kid. And so you have Chinese sociologists really worried about the potential effect of the one-child family on their kids. That said, I also know a lot of Chinese kids who are from one-child families, and I find them perhaps en masse maybe to be not as tough as a previous generation, but I also find them to be really entrepreneurial, really smart, yes, they have helicopter parents, but they're great at violin and piano. And so I look at that kind of dime store sociology on them, thinking that the Chinese family structure is just, and I don't really think it's that serious. I do think the demographic issue is a more serious problem that China will be saddled with as it tries to become a rich country. Because by removing those people from their workforce, they really, in many ways, damn themselves to actually a relatively low growth rate into the future. And so I'm torn in a way about the social effects of the one-child policy. I really am. Because en masse, I can kind of agree with it, but I know so many single Chinese kids and I'm really impressed by them that generally speaking, maybe my sample is too small, but I'm just so impressed by them that I don't really think that's going to be China's biggest problem. I think the biggest problem is the fact that they're just not going to have enough people in their workforce as they strive to become a richer country. I think the Chinese have been obsessed with this idea that America wants to contain China for a long time. And they're obsessed with it. They have a couple of facts. Like after 1989, the United States slapped embargoes on selling Chinese military equipment. Because before '89, we actually had a very robust relationship in selling China weapons. In fact, we gave China some technology that was really quite useful in their fight against Vietnam. And so after '89, we stopped doing that. But that was only a tiny percentage of our exports to China. It's really tiny. And for the Chinese to say, aha, this is the first example of you trying to contain China. And then broadening it from that, you have the Americans and their allies near China occasionally banding together against China when China does things that they don't agree with. So the Hanoi meeting in July of 2011, when Hillary Clinton kind of worked up everybody to push back on China's South China Sea issues. So on one hand, I think that part of the problem is that the Chinese party state wants to convince Chinese consumers of information that America's out to get it, right? America's trying to contain China because it fits into the narrative of China as being humiliated by the West, and this is just another example of Western humiliation, and we're going to push back at you, and we need to band together against these horrible American imperialists. So it fits into their narrative. On the other hand, the United States has always played people off, countries off against each other in Asia. That's how we've rolled for more than 200 years. We've always tried to ensure, for better or worse, that there's no big hegemon in Asia. So in the 19th century, we pushed people against the British. Then we tried to get people to fight against the Tsar from Russia. Then we tried to get people to push back against the Japanese, so much so that we actually fought a war with Japan. Then we tried to fight against the Soviets in Asia. The Korean War would be an example. And now we are organizing people occasionally to push back against China as well. But we have such a different relationship with China in so many other areas, in trade, scientific cooperation, etc., that to say that by doing that, it's a pure example of us containing China, trying to keep China out. It's just a way that we've continued because our basic policy is that Asia should be open. And we've had that policy since the 1780s, when we were tiny, when we had no power at all. And so, yes, I completely agree with that. If you're looking at the threat to the United States, North Korea far more serious, and Russia in terms of their games in Ukraine and potentially their games in Eastern Europe, but far more serious than China will ever be to us. Partially because our relationship is so much deeper than what it used to be in the Cold War. So what is going to happen with the Chinese economy is kind of the $64 trillion question. Because on one hand, that according to kind of traditional Western ideas, it cannot continue like this for very long because the debt is so high. On the other hand, it is still very much in many ways a closed system where state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks are lending to other state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks. And there's no one going to say, hey, I can't pay back my loan, and the thing unravels like it began to unravel in 2008 in Florida, in our system. And so the Chinese have a significant amount of fungibility in their ability to continue on this game of rolling over the loans and creating these distressed loan portfolios that are then bought and sold by other Chinese state-owned companies. I think Steve Bannon praised China in a way similar because he also understands that America embraced that Chinese model of development in the 1900s. And I think Bannon kind of wants to go back to that period of time where America had high tariffs, where America was involved in subsidizing its businesses, similar to what the Chinese are doing. And I think he, in a way, he's nostalgic for that period of time. I don't think that's actually going to get America to become the economy of the 21st century, but Bannon has significant nostalgia for a nation that was white and shut off from the rest of the world. And so from that perspective, clearly he would praise China. So I think what happens with the Chinese economy is very much an open question, though. So. Yeah, so I'm not a real believer in the Thucydides trap and that in the inevitability of this type of conflict. For one, because I think that I do believe that in the special nature of the relationship in a way, and there's enormous deep ties between the two countries. And you could say, well, yeah, the Brits and the Germans had a special relationship as well. And they were related, in fact, in the royal family. They went to war. But I think that there's just a lot deeper strands between the two sides. But secondly, I also think that much more so than Greek history, America has its own history in Asia, which goes back a very long time, from the founding of our republic. And we've pursued that history in fits and starts in a generally relatively logical way of trying to balance. Now, there have been eruptions, for example, World War II, clearly, that we've been involved in. And one would hope we would not get into that situation with China. But I think the Americans, if we learn something from our history, it's that we do have the ability, when we're consistent, to manage Asia so that a hegemon doesn't rise up and begin to exert itself across the Asian landmass. And I think that if we've learned from history, I think we could clearly avoid a war with China. Now, 10 years in the future, it's anybody's guess. I think the significant issue is that China's political system is going to evolve. We have no idea what direction it's going to evolve, but my guess is it's going to evolve in probably a more liberal direction. I think that it's gone 6 steps backwards in the current period of time, but I think that the generation of young Chinese kids is significantly different than the generation of people I went to school with in China. My classmates were born in the late 50s and early 60s, and they're the parents, actually, of the Chinese people here in terms of that generation. And the demands of that generation for personal freedom will bleed naturally into the political sector. And I think that those questions are questions that China has yet to answer. And so the idea that China is going to stay the same in terms of its politics from today versus 10 years from now, I think is a huge assumption, and I don't buy it at all. I don't believe that China is going to evolve into a democracy just like ours. Who would want to? But I also think that there's going to be a development in fits and starts towards a more liberal future, partially because, back to your issue, these single family kids are just so much more self-centered than their parents were. They're going to be pushing, in many ways, for more freedom, and that freedom will naturally bleed in. Now, Americans have a tendency to be really impatient when it comes to China. It's like 1989, you're not a democracy, we hate you, right? 2017, you're not free, you're horrible. And I think that China moves on a different time, very much so, specifically because in 1989, none of those people who were marching in the square had anything, right? There was no apartment ownership in Beijing, whereas now 80% of Chinese have an access, either individually or through their family, to property. My classmates from Nanjing University, they have big screen TVs as big as my Honda Odyssey, right? So they have stuff now, and that possession has made people naturally much more conservative. At the same time, it's pushed them into wanting a party or a type of government where it's predictable, where they know they're not going to lose their apartment, where they know that they can have a contract that will be held up in court. And that type of desire and need, I think, will naturally push for greater liberalization in the country. And I think I'm actually long-term optimistic, short-term very pessimistic. In some cases, and that's actually one of the interesting changes you see over the course of the last few months since the rise of the Donald, where the Chinese were always considered the unstable part of the relationship. And now suddenly we become the question mark. And if you look at Xi Jinping's speech at Davos, on one hand, this is his speech in January at Davos. On one hand, it was a speech where the Chinese embraced globalization. It was sort of this cynical play to try to get points from the rest of the world for being the mature adult. But on the other hand, it was also this kind of subconscious plea to the United States not to dump all this stuff, not to dump this system that America has spent a lot of time creating and that China has spent many years benefiting from, right, into the toilet. And so yeah, I take your point, right? So China's evolution is my sense is it's probably going to go in a positive direction. And you're right, it's very unclear what evolution we're going to go in this country as well. I'm actually sort of long-term optimistic here. Maybe it's because I've moved to Berkeley and I've drunk the Kool-Aid. I guess what really surprised me is that how we are in a continual process of discovering the other one, and that we don't really spend a lot of time learning from our history, and that Americans can go to China, come back from China after a week, and write to other Americans, and with this attitude of like, I've just discovered a new country, when in reality we've been doing this since 1783. And in some ways the Chinese do the same. The Chinese are actually a little bit more measured on these issues, but we can get overly enthusiastic about this kind of stuff. And that process of this continual process of discovering each other and how similar in a way the patterns that we think about each other have maintained. We're in a new period though. And so whether the cycle is going to be broken, I think, is a really open question too.